Hi, I'm Lizzie Harper of lizzieharper.co.uk, and I've been asked by people who watch my YouTube channel if I could put together a quick video explaining how I go about drawing a plant when either that plant is not in flower, or it's the middle of winter, or maybe you're somewhere geographically different from where that plant is growing. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this film. Slightly challenging because a lot of what I need to do is draw up the plant in pencil on a large sheet of paper, which is quite difficult to film, but we can sort of make our way around that, and I'll explain the processes. So I'm going to share all the different resources that I generally use when I'm having to draw a plant out of season with you today. And the plant that I'm going to be doing is it's an assortment of common British grasses, which I love painting, and none of them are out. It's February, it's cold, it's miserable out there. They're certainly not in flower. So how do you do a sheet of beautiful blooming grasses in the middle of February? So hopefully, if you watch, there might be some tips and some resources that might be of use to you guys. So yeah, let's see what we can do. The first thing I do when I have to paint a plant that isn't in flower and that I can't get my hands on is to gather reference. So as I say, it's winter right now and I've got to paint these 4 grasses. So the first thing I do is do a lot of gathering of reference. So this is Grasses of the British Isles, the BSBI handbook, and I will go through and take notes on all the written descriptions and also reference the illustrated descriptions. Get all the measurements, get all my notes down so I know exactly what I'm talking about. And also in the text, it will also tell you what needs to be focused on. So for example, Coxfoot, Dactylius glomerata, one of the things that is important is as it grows up, the shoot is, it's got a very keeled sort of leaf to it. So that's something that needs to be included. And also there are sort of kind of spikes on the back of the lemmas and the blooms. And again, so I'll do that for each species. So for the Yorkshire fog, you take all your notes, decide what details you need to include. For the Coxfoot, which is there, crested dog's tail, and what was the last one? Oh, false oat-grass. The other thing I'll do is I gather my own reference. So this is crested dog's hair grass, which I did a while ago. So I print off a copy of that. That's Yorkshire fog, false oat-grass. And then again, focusing on the written information that I was discussing, I look for the things that are species specific and that I need to include details of. So for example, with Yorkshire fog, I know that it's important that the spine here on the floret, it has a, this is an awn, it's a hook, it's called an awn. And the sterile ones, these dry, and when they dry, they hook back like fish hooks. So getting a photo of that is really important. And there's another photo there. It's always important to get several bits of reference. This, I know that as that plant, as the flowering spike, as the panicle comes out, they either look like this when they're still kind of half enclosed in those soft, beautiful leaves. And also I wanted to make sure I had the purple flush right, because it's a very specific colour. And then once it's open, the inflorescence looks like that. So that way I can include that. For the Coxfoot, this is my illustration again, and things I wanted to focus on here are the colour of the grass. I thought that was quite a good colour. I know it's quite bluish from personal experience. The Legules, which are these little kind of filamentous membranous things where the leaf joins the stem. And again, this is to do with what I was saying about the keel of the young plant, and also the colour of the flowering spike. Close up of the flowering spike. Again, lots of different references. It's always important to have lots and lots of references. False oat-grass, again, I wanted to double check my colouring, because when it's dry and mature, it goes very sort of straw-like. But also when it's younger, it's kind of flushed with red, as you can see from there. That's from the BSBI reference. You've got to make sure that your reference is reliable. I have a whole list of websites that I go to for reference that I rely on. So once you've done that, that's great. And then also I look in books that I trust and work with often. So for example, these are grasses, all of these are grasses. So these are my different grasses ones that I'll go to. So I'll go to Collins, which is illustrated by Fitter. So again, there's your crested dog's hair. And I'll also look up in this one, which is Francis Rose, grasses, sedges, rushes and ferns. And again, this is the false oat grass. You'll find different things are used for different species. This is Phillips, grasses, ferns, mosses and lichens of Great Britain and Ireland. And that's just a really nice photo. I particularly find that branch very distinctive for Coxfoot. And these are my own illustrations, but this is a HarperCollins flower guide by David Streeter. And here again, this is a crested dog's hair. So I gather all the information, and I normally make a little chart like this, where I write down the name of the plant and then the different reference books that I've got here, and then what page I can find my reference in. And then I go through and I decide if that's not good reference for that particular plant, I'll circle the one that is, piece together what my different references are going to be, which the best bits are. And then, where's my next sheet of paper? And then literally this is figuring out how I want it to look. So to start with, I thought, well, is it going to be portrait? And I thought that's not going to work. There's not room for it to be a portrait orientation. So it's going to be landscape. And we need all four of these in a sketchbook style next to each other. So again, then you have a little think about the plants. You've already familiarised yourself with them. So the Coxfoot is actually a very tall plant. So that's going to go in the middle. And the Cynosaurus, that also, the crested dog's hair, that grows pretty straight. Whereas the false oat grass is much more likely to curve. So we can use that in the composition. And also the Holcus lanatus, the Yorkshire fog, that tends to curve. So these are going to flank these two. And then I had to figure out where I was going to put the details. So literally, look, the details are just scribbles. But it reminds me that I need to do a detail of the ligule, which is those membranes that I was talking about where the leaf attaches to the stem. The spikelet, which is, again, I mean, there we go, that's spikelets. These are the close-ups of the flowers of the grasses. And yeah, and once I've got all those things together, this is my this is my notes for the composition. So yeah, with no reference at all, I'm now in a position where I feel I have enough knowledge and enough visual reference to try and draw up these four species of grass together. I've drawn up the pencil rough of the false oat grass, and I've done that by checking out my compositional sketch, which reminded me that the plant was to go here, one of four, and that the details were to go below, and that it kind of had to slightly sway outwards, which you can see is translated into the illustration. The first thing is to check your notes, your written notes, which are here, to see what things really need to be focused on. In this case, it's these nodes here at the bottom, which are rather like corms, they're swollen, and it's a bit hard to see. But these nodes here, where the grass bends, they're slightly hairy, and there's some details to do with the spikelets, to do with the flowers, and the awns, which are the little bits that come off the back of them. So that needs to be included. So I took all sorts of different elements from different places. A lot of the leaves I took from this illustration I did a while ago, and also details here of the spikelet. I took some more reference on the leaves from this photograph in the Phillips book. I took, this is a heavy book. I took some of the basal leaf detail from the illustration of the false oat grass I did way back when for HarperCollins. The loose panicle, where it's all unfolded, this is the illustrations by Rose. I used this reference. And I also know that false oat grass, you see, so there's the loose, there's the panicle when it's all kind of branched and unfolded. But then to start with, when it's younger, it's all tucked in behind a leaf. And for that, I used this reference. In terms of what things are, I used another thing here which explains the anatomy, because I always need to be reminded. Yorkshire fog, Hocus lunatus. So, drawing this one up, where did I get my reference from? Well, actually, in this case, the illustration that I've done, I really quite like. So, as you'll see, it's pretty closely based on that, along with some information from the flowering spike from Phillips. And when it comes to the spikelets and the ligule, then again the BSBI handbook was very useful indeed. And a lot of the thing with Yorkshire fog, it seems to have gone out of focus. A lot of the thing with Yorkshire fog is actually the colour. So that'll be easy enough to do, because these little spikelets, these flowers are very pale and they're flush purple. It's my favourite grass. I'm very, very familiar with it. So actually drawing it isn't that bad. I did want this kind of semi-enclosed panicle to be there, so that, again, I found reference on the internet and adapted it. And you see here, these are details of each individual flower. There you go. And this is particularly distinctive, this awn, this little spike, which curves back on itself at maturity and ends up looking rather a lot like a fish hook. And that comes out the lemma. So when it came to doing the details, there you go, we have that awn in there. And then there's a bit more of a detail there to show that, because it is so distinctive. And look here, the stripes I was talking about. Some botanists call them like pyjama stripes, which is weird because my pyjamas don't have pink stripes on them. Ligule, pretty straightforward. Interesting facts about Yorkshire fog. Sometimes it's not very efficient at producing seeds, and sometimes it's only the bottom, the lowest floret of each spike that will produce a caryopsis, a viable seed. But it still seems to do extremely well. It'll root at the nodes, and then it will put up a big vegetative shoot, which means that there's lots of clumps of sort of this bluish, beautiful, soft grass, which is sometimes referred to as mops. So yeah, again, it was another example of using, yeah, the Phillips book here, my own reference here, internet reference from respected and trusted sites. I even looked at Francis Rose, but I didn't much like it. There's something, it's almost right, but it's not quite, doesn't feel quite right to me, the Francis Rose. And that's the Francis Rose. And Collins' Guide to Grasses, Sedges, Rushes and Ferns by Fitter. It's a good one. Like I said, the BSBI Grasses Handbook. She's written by, I should tell you that, shouldn't I? There you go, Tom Cope and Alan Gray. It's an absolute beauty. You can get a similar one, but all about sedges. BSBI publications are excellent. They can't be faulted. And then, of course, my own illustration here in the Collins Flower Guide by Streeter. So there you go. In answer to the question, how do you draw up an illustration of a plant when you don't have any reference? I guess the answer is you jigsaw it together. You gather your reference from as many different sources as you need, and from trustworthy sources, and then using different elements from each, you piece it all together, bearing in mind the composition as you go along and trying not to mess up too much. I will return and add to this video once I've had the go ahead from the client, and once I've added colour. And in that case, the colour is one of the trickiest things to do without any biological specimens. So I actually know where this one and this one and this one grow vegetatively in the winter. So I'll be out scrabbling amongst the frost, trying to find some leaves which will help me nail the colour. But there you go. You see, it doesn't matter what plant you've got. If you've got good reference and the internet and a mind to succeed, then you can draw a plant even if it's out of season, and even if you can't get your hands on the specimen itself. So today I'm going to be painting this grass, the False Oat-grass Arrhenatheriumelatius. Again, like I say, haven't got any reference. It's the middle of February, but Partly I recognise it, and that is also very useful if you've got a good memory for colour. And I've got, reference-wise, I've got my own illustration to work from. And I realised what I've been doing with this, I've been saying, oh yeah, use your own illustrations. What if you haven't got your own illustrations? Well, I'd always advise you to keep a sketchbook where you can make notes on plants that you draw. So this is, I mean, this is a finished illustration done for Field Studies Council. But it was based on, let me see if I can just get one of my notebooks out. I know you've all seen these already, but these kind of things. So that's a self-heal, and that's a forget-me-not. Just lots of tiny little details, especially about colour and how to mix colour and structure. And I keep these sketchbooks, and they're very useful. But yeah, if you haven't got your own sketchbook, and if you haven't got an illustration you've done previously, then do be careful. I mean, have a really good long look on the internet and see if you can find something that feels like it's the right colour. So for this one, I mean, I know because I'm filming this, there's all sorts of differences of colour. But this photo ref that I found of the flowering, of the inflorescence, that green is about right. I know it is. It's got quite a lot of brown in it. So the first thing to do is to mix up the green. Sometimes also in the written information about a species, you might find some colour notes. They might say something like very yellowish or a bluish colour. And also here your botany comes in, so various things mean different things. Glaucus means bluish. Who knew? Why don't you just say bluish? But anyway, it does. Various things like that. So this is, I'm mixing up the colour, and obviously this is way, way too bright green. This is Daniel Smith Spring Green, which is going to be the base of my green. Generally, don't use greens fresh from the pan. In order to make them look more realistic, you're going to want to mix them with other colours, especially if you're doing botanical illustration. There's something quite stark about pre-mixed greens. So I'm mixing in here quite a lot of yellow ochre, which I always mix in with my greens. It takes the edge off them. It makes them less, I think it makes them softer somehow. So I don't know if you can see how that's changing that green. It's making it less in your face. Okay, I'm also going to add a little bit of Van Dyke Brown, which is just here. And again, you can see from my pens, they look really scruffy, and they are. So I buy pans, and then I top them up when they wear down. I top them up from the tube. Now, there's a lot of suggestion that you shouldn't do that, and I'm sure there are very good reasons why you shouldn't do it. But I've been doing it all my life, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. Okay, that's not far off, actually. I might add a tiny bit of purple. A lot of this stuff, just play around with it. You know, just play around with mixing the colours. Sometimes it takes ages to mix the right colour. And what I like to do when I have the specimen is I like to paint a little swatch of the colour I've mixed right alongside it, or actually even onto the leaf itself. But of course I haven't got the specimen, I can't do that. And can you see I've mixed up quite a lot of this paint? What you really don't want is to mix up a tiny bit of the perfect colour, and then, oh heaven help you, halfway through the leaf you've run out of that, and you've got to remix, and it's never going to be exactly the same, and you put your head in your hands and you weep and you weep and you weep. So make sure that you mix enough. Okay, I think that's good enough. That's quite a good match, I think. So that's the spring green, the yellow ochre, touch of Van Dyke Brown, and a tiny bit of purple. And in terms of getting to know what colours mix, that really is a big part of that. Is just, you get used to it. You learn what colours to mix together to get to the final colour that you want. So the paints I'm using are Winsor and Newton watercolours, and and the brush. Never leave a sentence unfinished. And the brush is Winsor & Newton Series 7, and it's a number 1. I have been looking for synthetic brushes, and in fact you can see some of my quest for a synthetic brush if you check out my other YouTube films. But for now I haven't found anything. I'm going to zoom in on this leaf, because this is the leaf I'm going to paint. This is actually just to show you how very easy it is to paint a leaf. So make sure that you've got a point on your brush, which you can do by rolling your paintbrush in the paint. And then literally,
you're going to outline the pencil, go over the pencil line that you've drawn. And if you stop breathing as you do that, that is not unusual. Just remember to breathe again at some point in the future. Okay. And all I'm doing is, in the same way as if I was painting something that wasn't a grass, I'd be painting the veins. Same thing here. So grasses or monocots have these parallel veins, which makes it, for us as botanical illustrators, a lot easier to paint than doing them when they're all branching and going sideways and things. And there are quite a lot of plants that are monocots. So plants, well, they fall into lots of different categories, but a great many plants are either either dicots or eudicots and monocots. And grasses and sedges and rushes and all that lot, they're all monocots. But lots and lots of other plants you might necessarily think of are also monocots. So things like bluebell and wild garlic and orchids, really you can tell a monocot if you just think about its leaf and if its veins are parallel to one another. So literally just plotting them in. Good trick if you're trying to do a straight line is, instead of looking at the nib of your brush, just take a little look to where you're going. So the bet where the line is going to terminate. So down the bottom of this leaf. Gentlest of touches. So you do need quite good control. You need to be holding your finger and your thumb quite tightly together, and then you can exert quite a lot of control over the nib of the brush. You really don't need to press very hard. The other thing you need to do is make sure you need to go with the brush. So if I was to do this line going the other way, like that, I'd be pushing against the line of the brush, and it would look an absolute mess. It would look hideous. It would be all blurry and the edges would be all splayed. So don't do that. Okay, I also sometimes go over the very edge again. Give a bit of distinction. Definition, not distinction. Distinction's like being posh, isn't it? Right, okay. And then I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see. Yeah, that's all right. It's quite hard when I'm filming to see what I'm zoomed in on, what I'm not zoomed in on. Partly just because filming is a bit tricky, but also because I'm a careless creature and my phone gets flung to the floor all the time, especially in the kitchen. And my kitchen has it's quite an old house I live in, I'm lucky, but it's got a a flagstone floor. And it is not forgiving if you choose to drop your phone, even if you have all the kind of protective screens on. So, yeah, my screen is not as clear as perhaps one would like it to be. Okay, so this is the top bit of this particular blade of grass. It's twisted. Also, what I try and do when I'm doing these grasses is not to let the lines touch one another. She says almost definitely being about to do exactly that. And can you see just here, this is the bend just here, I'm leaving a tiny little white line. Can you see it on the film? Maybe you can't. Let me zoom in for a moment. Yeah, so you can see that tiny little white line between where this has folded over and where this leaf continues, this blade of grass continues. Okay, I'll zoom out again now, I've shown you that bit. So really all we're doing is putting in the detail. It's exactly the same as, sorry, it's quite hard when you're doing one line to talk at the same time. It's exactly the same as when I'm doing other plants and I put all the detailing in first and all the kind of mid-tones and details and then layer colour on top. We're doing exactly the same with the grasses. Same system. This is also quite good revision for me, this is, doing this sheet of grasses, because I'm teaching a 2-day workshop in June at Cambridge University Botanic Gardens on painting sedges and grasses. Now, you know, I've been honest in the write-up as well. I'm no expert on this stuff. I'm far from being a botanist, but I do have a real passion for them. I think they're glorious plants. But so reminding myself of all the anatomy and stuff of these plants is not a bad idea. Okay, now to spare you the pain, what I might just do, I think I will do, I'm going to do just one more leaf. I've also got on my desk, and you won't be able to see, but I've got on my desk all my reference laid out. So I've got my photos, I've got the reproduction of my own drawing, I've got my written notes, I've got the books that I was referencing earlier when I was talking to you about how you come up with the illustrations. It's all there literally, so that if I need to reach out and get it, I can. Because you do need to have it right there. So this is going to be slightly heavier line. Okay. So a lot of people, I remember my dear sister-in-law, I went to walk with her a while ago, and she knows that I know about a little bit about grasses, and she's like, you know, is a grass just a grass? And we were walking through a field, and literally from walking about 100 yards, we found 5 or 6 totally different, diverse species of grass. And she was so sweet about it. She's like, gosh, I always just sort of thought a grass was a green grass, but of course it's not. They've got such variety. Whoops. They've got such variety of form, and they just get overlooked, and I'm not quite sure why. I guess they're not kind of blousy, are they? They're not all petals. But I really, really love grasses. I think they're great. I spend, you know, every year I look to go on various courses to increase my knowledge with botanists. There are loads of organisations who give really good, you can go on courses and learn more about all sorts of things. Field Studies Council in the UK, they're great. I went on a really cool course last year about rocky shore ecosystems, where I learned about things like barnacles and sea slugs and limpets and ocean currents. But yeah, courses on grasses are good as well. The other thing is, people are often like, oh yeah, grasses are so simple, they're such primitive plants. And actually, I think I read that there's quite a suggestion that the opposite is true, that actually grasses are possibly, they evolved from, you know, they came after and are more advanced than things like your rose or your or your other sort of flowering plants. There's a suggestion that they're just as well adapted and in no way primitive. And you know, I think it's quite cunning. So you know how flowers have blooms and things to attract their pollinators or make sure that the insects come and pollen and all that stuff. And that's great, you know, sure, it's great. But it's very expensive for the plant. Whereas if you're wind pollinated, like a grass is, then yeah, you do have to produce more seeds. Of course you do, because it's less of a certain tactic. But I think it probably ends up being a little bit cheaper. I think it's quite a cunning ploy, really. And you can see in that, see, I'm using the side there. That went wrong because I was pushing with my brush and I ended up using the side rather than the tip, which meant that the line went very broad. And those of you who suffer from hay fever will know all about grass pollen and how on warm summer days the air is full of it. And again, that is so that the plants can be pollinated by the wind. And then when they are, they'll produce their seeds, their caryopsis. Grains, I guess you could call them as well. Have I fixed that error? Yes, I have, more or less. It's close. But can you see where I did that, where I got that line a bit wrong? I don't know if you can see. It's a bit harder. Yeah, it's just a bit blunter. And that's what happens if you get your initial lines wrong. It ends up just, the painting looks a bit blunt. It isn't necessarily destroyed, but it's just a bit blunt. Okay, nice sharp tip. And if you're starting out doing illustration, it's worth spending a little bit of time just practicing your straight lines. You know, can you paint a consistent thin line that isn't loads thicker or loads thinner as you go along, and which does end up more or less heading to the area on your drawing where you want it to. Everything needs practice, right? So drawing and painting is no different. So I'm doing that a little bit. This is what I do with the leaves. It's not actually botanically entirely honest. So if you look at a blade of grass, it isn't necessarily keeled. It doesn't always have this kind of halfway juncture. Some do. Like Coxfoot, dactylis, it's really quite clear quite often. But some really don't. However, visually, it's enormously helpful if you almost divide one side of the grass from the other. Okay, this bottom one down here. I'm obviously not going to torture you lot by making you watch me paint this whole grass. What I'm going to do now actually is I'm going to finish doing this initial layer of the detailing of the grass, and then I'll come back to show what happens when I put a wash on top and take it to the next stage. I've finished doing the lines of the leaves, and here can you see these leaves, which are kind of old and are dead, well, deader. As well as doing the green lines, I've mixed the green with a bit of yellow and done some yellow lines, and even added a little bit of yellow ochre and stuff. So that just means that they look more realistic, kind of less perfect. And at the base of grass plants, that often is the case. Again, I'm doing this without reference. It's just from observation. You tend to know that these things happen. Next thing I'm going to do is mix up the colour of the stems, which is quite a yellowish green, and then I'll get back to you. So this is the stem colour I've mixed. It's this green that I mixed originally for the grass, coupled with cadmium yellow, this one, cadmium yellow dark. You're meant to keep your yellows entirely devoid of green, but I don't know how to do that. If anybody knows how to do that, share with me. So yeah, so and then I'm going to do this again, outlining the stems. What's under the actual screen, so you can see. Oh, rolling that tip to make sure it's nice and sharp, and then taking your heart into your mouth and doing a straight line. And again, what I was saying about looking where you're going rather than at the tip of the brush is very important when you're doing long straight lines like this. And can you see how it's darker? Sorry, it's darker on the right hand side than on the left hand side, and at the where it hits a node, it's also slightly darker. But really, it is just two lines. So there's one line on this side, like that, and then one line on this side. Whoops, I've got a bit of fluff on my brush. That's annoying. And then just sort of adding a little bit of backfill. Same again up here. One line on this side, and one line on the other side. And I'm now going to just plotting all these stems across the entire grass, and then I'll be plotting in the spikelets, the flowers, before adding top washes and stuff. Yeah, I've drawn in all of these lines and things, and in fact it led to a couple of really interesting things, which is always what happens. So as I was drawing the stems up, I suddenly realised that the nodes, these little bits here, I didn't know what colour they were. So again, I had to go back online, supplement my research by Google imaging Arrhenatheriumelatius nodes, and it comes back with them being similar colour to the stem, slightly hairy, which I did know, and also flushed with a tiny bit of purple. So when we've put this top lot on, I'll do that. Another part I really haven't managed to sort out so well is down here. They have these nodes, the basal nodes are rather like corms, the kind of things that bulbs will grow from. And again, they're kind of whitish, yellowish. So I looked at 6 or 7 different images on the internet. They're kind of yellowish. So this is not brilliant. This is not correct. And even working with the reference I found online, I'm still slightly at a loss about exactly what I should be looking at. So I've said it before, but with all of these illustrations that you do without reference, actually 9 times out of 10 you just feel like saying, oh my gosh, just give me the reference, because it would make my life so much easier. I could colour match, I could structurally see. Like with these nodes, I don't know what happens, whether there's a kind of sheath of grass blades on top of them, or whether they're just smooth. It was really hard to distinguish and to figure that out from the illustration, from the photos. So yeah, always, if you can get your hands on it, get your hands on proper real ref. Now, to make the colour for the grass blades, this is exactly the same one that I've mixed here, that we did all the outlining in, but it's much, can you see, I'm literally adding drops of water to it to make it slightly lighter, because you make things paler with watercolour by adding water. I'm also adding a touch of yellow to it to slightly change the colour, but it's quite watery. It's certainly more watery than the initial one was. I think I've gone too yellow there, so again I'm going to add a tiny touch of blue to bring it back to the colour I want it to be. Yeah, okay, that'll do. More water. See how watery it is? It's really quite liquid. So now what I'm going to do is, let's zoom in just on one leaf to show you guys this. Okay, so literally with my brush very wet, just on one side of each blade, lay down that watery top wash without going over the lines. Really quick. And the top bit, did it switched, so this side will be the one that's darker because it's gone around the corner. Oops, that doesn't matter too much. And let's just do this one as well. Same thing. Load up your brush. And what I'm going to do is just go across with all of these leaf blades really quickly. Put this wet top wash on one side of each blade. And then we're going to allow it all to dry completely. So, well, I'll show you why in a minute. Okay, so that's what I'm doing now. I'll do that and I'll come back once all those paints are dry. And while those leaves dry, I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but with the stems. So this is actually the same mix of the stem, but can you see much more watery because I've just added clear water to it. And the stems are even easier than the grass's leaves, and the grass's leaves are pretty darned easy. Literally, you just go over them like that. Stay within the line. And if you keep it nice and wet, then you also have the advantage of when it dries, you're going to have that crisp edge that just happens because of the physics of watercolour drying. It leaves a kind of tide line, which is a very beautiful, can be a very beautiful thing. And it adds to the crispness of the illustration. These nodes, I've gone over them with a little bit of yellow because they're a little paler than the stems. And then once that's dry, I'll come back and put that flush of purple that I was talking about. But you can see, actually I've done something fatal here. Never do this. I've coloured in the stems on this plant, and now I need to go over the top and colour in the stems on that plant, which you really shouldn't do, because I will ideally be leading my little finger on the bit I've just painted. Let's see if I can get away with it. It's not a clever thing to have done. It just goes to show that even if you're quite practiced at these things, you can still be an absolute fool. Can you see that little bit of white just in there? You probably can't. Zoom in again. Can I get that on the screen without moving the whole setup? Hold on. I think I can. Yeah, this little bit of white just there. Do you remember I was talking about the ligule? The where is it? That bit there, the ligule. That sometimes shows up. So even when you're looking at the plant. So I've left a little bit of white there to suggest the ligule. Okay, here we go. Just over the top, over the top. Stop breathing for a second or two. Something else I do is I will take the colour slightly up. So I'll go within the lines, obviously, but then I'll take the colour slightly onto the leaf blade or whatever it may be, because then it blends in and it's not so stark. It makes it easier for the eye to believe in what you're doing. And that's really what art is. Well, what illustration is you're fooling the eye. You're tricking it into believing something is real or close to real. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, so down here, down the bottom bit, I sort of did these without telling you a lot about it. So first we've got that culm thing, which is just a bit of a disaster. What would I give to get my hands on some culms? In 6 weeks' time, this grass is going to be up. In 8 weeks' time, it'll be flowering. It would be so easy to dig it up and see what those look like. I can't. So I've done the best I can, and I'm hoping nobody will look too closely. But can you see there's a variety of colours in here with the older leaves? And these have got just different layers of these washes I've been talking about. So there's quite a lot of yellow in. And that yellow stem that I was talking about just now that I was doing, I'm going to put a layer of that on there. Keeping it all light. I mean, the problem with watercolour is once you go too dark, you can't lift that colour again. And you need to use the whites of the page as your highlights. You really don't ever want to use white colour, because it looks chalky and nasty. So I'm going to let the stems dry as well, and then we'll put the second layer onto the leaves, and hopefully they'll start to look a bit more realistic. While I wait for those stems and stuff to dry, I can work into the tip of these leaves, and this is just pure Van Dyke brown, and I just want to crisp up the tips. And again, when these grasses get old, they tend to degrade most at the tips. That's the bit that has the roughest wear and tear and dries out fastest. So, and again, it's sort of brownish, but there's often little speckles and bits of sort of suggestion of wear and tear and disease. It tends, I know from experience, to anchor towards the side veins a little bit, and right up to the very tip. And again here, I don't want too much here, just a suggestion that it's dried out a little bit, and the brown will give us that suggestion. And again, you want to be super delicate with this, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to make it look like the leaves are meant to be brown. It's meant to suggest degradation in some small way. And the very tip of that bottom one, it needs even darker. So I've got that Van Dyke brown, and I'm adding a touch of purple to darken it even more, so that you can see that'll crisp it up a little bit. And while I'm at it, I'll put in that shade there, tiny touch there, and let's put a tiny bit of in the middle of those areas of disease. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And that's a bit blunt, I don't like that much. What's gone wrong there? There, now this is pure purple, I'm just trying to sharpen it a little bit, because it doesn't look right to me. There we are, that's a bit better. It's just outlining it really. Okay. So it's dry. Hooray! My grasses are dry. So to do the next overlay, I'm using that same green that I did for the first pass, and I'm mixing it with some of this colour, which is, I think it's called gold green or something. It's a kind of brownish, goldish, greenish. It's really pretty colour. And since I've sort of stumbled across it, I've used it a lot. And again, we're making a watery mix. Just a little bit yellower than the first pass. Okay. Oh, and you know when I was talking about sharpening the point of my brush, that's what I meant. You kind of roll your brush in the paint and it comes out with a slightly sharper tip. Sometimes this one's not a great brush to show it. Right, so my brush is charged, as they say. And literally, all you do with this, slam it on. Put that wash over the top. And like I was saying earlier, I'm going to bring a little bit of it. It's very pale, so I might even bring it down the stems a certain distance. Same again, coming up here, just put that wash over the whole lot of that leaf. There's no need in keeping any of it white anymore, because that's served its purpose. You're now ready to get close to finishing the leaves, all the way at the tip. And again, bringing it down the stem a little way. And it makes sense, biologically, it makes sense to bring the colour down the stem a little way, because these leaves, these blades start by growing around the stem. They sheathe the stem, and then they expand into these grass blades. So it makes sense that those are the same colour to a certain extent, because they're actually the same thing. And in some grasses you can tell the species by whether or not they're inflated, by whether or not the sheaths are kind of full of air, in which case they look sort of slightly bloated. It can be quite pretty. Coxfoot, for example, Dactylis glomerata, that's got quite inflated stems, quite inflated leaf sheaths. Okay, just covering it all over, trying not to go outside the lines. Trying my best. Okay. And I've already done exactly the same with the stems. You can see that they haven't got white on anymore. So they've got that same stem colour, which was kind of greenish yellow, watered down and just laid over the top and allowed to dry. I think I've just finished filming one film and it's gone on to another. I hope it's done that seamlessly. So there's purples and greens and yellows. And then when it gets older, it goes all straw coloured. Whew. So it's a bit tricky, but what I do know is that at the top of this plant, it tends to be much yellower and it becomes greener as you come down, because of course the oldest flowers are at the top. They're the ones that come out first, and then the lower ones come out later. So to do the flowers, we're going to do the same thing really. We're just going to outline them with different colours and then come back and put a different blob of top wash on. So the green that are going to be at the bottom are this. It's the same as the stem colour, right? So I'll just do a few to show you. Literally, all we're doing is we're outlining each of these little flowers. So these are representatives. I mean, I've just shown you a photo of the actual flower. Each flower is made of all sorts of different parts, of lemmas and glooms and the stamens, the stigmas, all of that stuff. But for our purposes, because we're working on this scale, what we want to do is, this is more of a suggestion really of how each of these little flowers, grass flowers, looks. So they're going to be green here, and then they're going to be a bit yellower. So I'm going to do a couple of greens up here, and then it's going to be a yellower green. And you'll see how I do it. As I move up, I'm going to become yellower and yellower. But for now, I'm just going to keep outlining the pencil lines that I've done, which when you're done with an illustration, actually, generally, you tend to be able to erase with a rubber, which is a good thing. I realised in the early part of this video I said some very uncharitable things about some of the illustrations and some of the grasses books I used, and I'm feeling extremely guilty because the people who wrote and illustrated those books know monumentally more than I do about all things grasses. So if I insulted anybody's abilities, I take it all back, because they are heroes in the world of grass knowledge and illustration. And I am a rank outside amateur who really likes grasses. Okay, so these, I mean, this bit coming off sideways, that's one of the lemmas, and that is flushed purple, so we will add some purple at some point, but not right now. Right now we're just doing the outlining in the green. And then the next colour I'm going to use is going to be yellower. So it's that same colour, but I'll put it here, and then if I just add some of this yellow. Oops. It's just a much yellower green. And then continue up the stem. Yet again, it's one of these things where what I'm going to have to do is just kind of fake it and use my own knowledge and hope for the best and jump in with my eyes shut kind of thing and be like, okay, well, I think it probably will be slightly flushed purple, but don't know for sure. And again, this is what this is all about, this whole video, explaining why drawing without reference is such a pain in the... It makes it much harder if you haven't got the actual plant right in front of you. So if some of you are just casting around thinking, oh, it's middle of winter, you know, don't know what I'll paint, oh, I'll just paint a... I would say, if you have a choice, if you haven't got somebody saying, okay, we need a illustration of this species by this time, I would say to you, please choose a plant that you can actually get your hands on. You will thank me for it, because then you can turn it around and see it from different angles. You can figure out what's happening lower down the plant, like with me and these swollen basal nodes, not knowing what's going on. You know, you won't have to spend hours trawling the internet, putting in different search terms to try and get imagery of the actual part of the plant you want. So those are done. Now what I'm going to do is literally, like we did before, wet, same colour that we started off with, and just fill them in. A blob of colour, don't go over the lines. And these ones, can you see? Does it show up just how wet it is? I might zoom in a sec, actually. So it's really wet, and it's sort of like it's like a little puddle of coloured water. And when it dries, it will leave those crisp edges that the watercolour does that I was telling you about, which will help us look like our work is crisper than perhaps our ability with the paintbrush gives us. Yeah. Oh, I've just realised, sorry. Zoom out, that might help everybody. Oh, come on, Lizzie. It is, oh gosh, it looks horrible. On the screen, it looks horrible. In real life, it looks really pretty. But can you see here how each of these little florets, that gives you some idea of the scale with my finger there. Each of them, they've dried with there's a pencil line there, but there's also slightly, there's a crisp line going around the edge as well, which is to do with the way the paint works. Okay, so I'm going to let them all dry, and then I'll come back and add the purple with you guys. This bit's super hard to film because I've turned the page around. So it's now at a different angle. So all I'm doing now is I've mixed up a purple and a red, and with the same brush I'm just outlining the top of each little flower and adding its awn. And if you remember rightly, the awns are curved, they go back on themselves, so we need to suggest that. The purple does not go all the way to the base. They're sort of flush towards the tip. So that's what I'm trying to do. And again, we're not really painting every single flower in detail. I haven't got the scope to do that. And the scale wouldn't make sense anyway. Just just these little ones with the purple up at the top. So I'm outlining them to give the suggestion of where those lemmas are, and painting in the awns at that funny angle, bent back on themselves with the tip of my number 1 paintbrush. And then when that's done, I'm just going to show you now, using a watery version of that purple. I plan on just putting a tiny little spot of purple on the tip of each of these florets and letting them dry. Now, however, it is time to do the shadows. So using just a bit of loo paper, I'm going to clean out that little divot in my paint box, and I'm going to mix up cobalt blue there we go, that's cobalt blue with one of my purples to make a kind of purpley blue shade. I don't know what colour you'd call that. Pretty colour. It's very similar, this colour that I mix up. It's a bit bluer, but it's very similar to I'm adding a bit of pink in because that's nice, to a colour that Daniel Smith Watercolour does called Moon Glow, which I have used in the past, but which I don't currently use, so mix my own. So this is the colour I tend to use to plot in my shadows. And put a tiny bit of black in it. I don't normally use black at all, but I just need to knock it back. It's looking a little bit too colourful today. There we go. So, again, doing that whirly curly thing to make my what? To make my paintbrush get a tip. Come on, focus, Harper, focus. Right. So, and now I'm going to block in my this is the bit I really like. This is the bit that normally brings the painting alive. So put in my darkest dark. So literally the places which will be darkest is here where it's going to join the stem, and the tips are nice and dark. It's another of those I can't breathe moments because I'm concentrating. And again, that leaf is going to cast a shadow over the stem, isn't it? Or the culm, I suppose, if I'm going to use the right word. There's going to be a bit of shadow here. Oh, God. Ah, big blob of there. Tissue paper. Always have some loo roll on your desk. And never panic. When things go wrong, you can normally rectify them. Not always, though. Working into that shadow, blending it in with the other colours, crisping things up, crisping up the edges. Where the grass has turned a corner, you're going to want some more shadow just to explain visually what's happened. And bringing that down. And where the grass twists, twisty, wisty. Well, here's where the culm, the stem, is casting a shadow. Here it's going to have a bit of shadow, and same again. The other thing to remember when you're painting, even if you're working to a drawing that you've already done, is you're always drawing. Even with the paints, you're redrawing all the time. So going over it with those repeated little strokes is just a way of blending it in slightly, so it isn't such a stark contrast. And again, doing this will help with the, remember we talk about the blades of grass and almost lying about them having a central keel. And again, underneath the nodes are slightly swollen, they'll be casting a shadow. So you just pick them out, you pick out your darks and you just plot them on in. Try and make it not too stark. Try and make it look natural. best of your ability. And I often take 2 swipes at this, so I often will do it with this and then I'll come in with super darks. This is, I've gone off the bottom of the page, haven't I? That's no use to anybody. I'll do super darks just to pick out your very, very darkest darks. But let me just crack on with my darks and I will return to you forthwith. I've done my darks now, and in fact I did the first pass using that slightly watery one, and the second darkest I used using that, which is almost dry, I think. On the hairs, on the nodes, again done with the number 1 paintbrush, teeny tiny. Yeah, we're on. Hold on, let's zoom in on that one, shall we? So you can see what I'm doing. Barely touching the page with the brush. And now I'm going to do it on the other nodes. And again, if I had the actual specimen here, I would have my hand lens out. I'd be able to look to see whether the hairs are growing forwards or backwards, how many they are, what colour they are. But it's a matter of make, do and mend. Okay, and now the last thing I have to do before calling it a day is I need to rub out the pencil lines. Thank you for sitting through my film showing you how to draw a specimen when you haven't got reference, in this case grasses. Here's the finished piece. And I'll put a scan up as well, along with the pencil roughs. So yeah, so what you need to do really, if you're drawing something without reference, you first need to get a lot of copious notes written explaining exactly what you need to be looking out for in that specimen. You need to use any of your own past reference, as you might have illustrated the plant before, maybe you've got sketchbooks, and then you need to have a lot of books that you rely on and trust. You know, this is the BSBI one, and then there's the Fitter, the grasses one, and then there's Streeter. And the internet is an amazing resource. If you get really stuck, you can always go on Twitter and ask people for help and advice. Sometimes they give it, sometimes they don't, but mostly they're very friendly about it. But you can draw things without reference. You can do it, and you can get it botanically accurate, and you can get it right. It's always easier to draw something with the reference, with the actual specimen in front of you, because then you can rotate it, you can colour check, you can examine it further. It's much, much easier. But don't be put off, you can do it without. Thank you for sitting through my film. You can have a look at lots of my other films on the YouTube channel. Most of them are done in real time, explaining how I work and the stages involved. I've also got a lot of blogs that you can check out on my website, www.lizzieharper.co.uk. And also on my website you can find loads of original illustrations for sale. You can just drop me an email if you want to buy any of them. Yeah, just have a browse. But thank you very much for your time and for sitting through this, and hopefully on some level at least it's helped you understand various of the stages and steps that you can do if you have to draw a plant and you don't have that plant right in front of you. Thanks for your time, and bye-bye.